This video is the first about modern technologies, and this is focusing on communication technologies. So according to the specification, what you need to know for this particular topic is how to set up an ad hoc network and what an ad hoc network is, obviously. That includes knowing what open Wi-Fi is, what tethering is, and what a personal hotspot is. We also need to know the security issues with having an open network. We need to look at the performance issues with ad hoc networks, so how good or bad they can be. And we need to look at the issues affecting network availability. So that's looking at where about the actual network is set up, looking at developed and developing countries, what infrastructure is available and what infrastructure actually means, and looking at network coverage and black spots. So starting with spec point 1, which is ad hoc networks, we need to know what an ad hoc network actually means. So when you hear the term ad hoc, it normally means that you've come up with something on the spot. So you might have heard it before when it comes to movies and TV shows where actors might think of things on the spot. It basically means the ability to set something up quite quickly without any massive specialist technology that you're going to need. So it's a temporary network with 2 or more computing devices, but it's only supposed to be used for a temporary basis. So you're not going to set it up and just keep it that way for a long time. It's a temporary network. Okay, one main point is that they don't necessarily require Wi-Fi access points or a router. So it could be set up using some other technology like Bluetooth. An ad hoc network could also be used between 2 laptops to connect them together so they can share files and internet access. So in other words, you can connect 2 devices together so that they can share multiple different resources such as files or an internet access connection. So for this exam, you might be asked to sometimes analyze why you might use an ad hoc network or why you might not use an ad hoc network. The best way of looking at this is to look at the benefits and drawbacks. Now, I've deliberately put benefits and drawbacks and advantages and disadvantages on this slide because they use both terms in the exam. So benefits is the same as advantages, drawbacks is the same as disadvantages. So the first advantage is that it's easy to set up. An ad hoc network is a very simple thing to set up. So in the exam, if you were to just write easy to set up, you would get the mark. Another advantage is no specialist hardware is required. So you can give an example such as a router or a server. You don't necessarily need anything technological, really advanced to set up this network. Disadvantages or drawbacks are that the network is less secure. That's because you're not using specialist hardware such as servers where you can add that level of security. The other disadvantage is there's no central device, which can make them quite difficult to manage. Now, if you've ever done anything about networks before, an ad hoc network is classed as a peer-to-peer network. So there is no central device. Basically what this is saying is that if you do have a central device, it allows you to push out software and updates to all the devices on the network in one go. With an ad hoc network, this isn't possible. One example of an ad hoc network is Bluetooth. So one way of connecting 2 different devices together is via Bluetooth. You might have used this yourself. Every time you use a game controller like an Xbox or PlayStation pad, it's going to use Bluetooth to connect to the console. Also, if you ever have a portable speaker, your phone will use Bluetooth to connect to the speaker. Anybody that might be in your parents' or someone's car, it allows you to connect via Bluetooth to the car computer as well and play your music through it. The main thing with Bluetooth, or the main kind of negative factor, is that you can only use it in a small space, small area of about 10 meters or less before you lose connection. So we need to look at open Wi-Fi. This is offered for free in many places. So that could be within an airport or a hotel or public transport such as buses and trains. You might have seen the logo for Open Wi-Fi or posters displayed around the place, basically suggesting that you can connect and use it for free. Now, some places, like I've seen it in airports, where you do have to actually request a password to be able to connect. Sometimes they make you pay for this. So it is like an open Wi-Fi network that allows you to use it, but sometimes they ask you to pay to get a password. But generally, when you think about open Wi-Fi, it's referring to this one where it's completely free. It allows you to see the network and just connect to it freely. You don't need a password, and it doesn't use any encryption. So the problem with it is that it's very insecure. So there's obviously some security issues with open Wi-Fi. Open Wi-Fi sends all the data that you're using on your device. So any pages that you access, any WhatsApp messages that you send, it sends it all in easy to read plain text. So any hacker that intercepts that data can actually view all of the data that you're sending. That could even be passwords that you use to log into websites. So you should only connect to Wi-Fi that uses a password, in my personal opinion. You could also use a virtual private network, which is called a VPN for short, and this will automatically encrypt all of the data that you use. So the main problem that we've got with ad hoc networks is performance issues. So they've usually, I would say, less reliable than traditional networks. The main things that you suffer with are poor signal. So if you've got poor signal or poor connectivity, you can obviously have a reduction in your access to the internet. You can also have where your devices disconnect. So you might have seen that in your house if you go too far away with your phone away from the router, or if you move your game controller out too far away from the PlayStation or Xbox, you might lose connection. The other problem is that if you start connecting multiple devices all together on the one network, it can make it very slow. So if anybody's ever had their phone set up as a hotspot and people are using that phone to connect to, you'll notice that it goes very, very slow. So speaking about hotspots, something called a personal hotspot. This allows you to connect to connect different devices to either a smartphone or a small pocket device. Most people tend to use this on public transport is where I've most commonly seen it done. So you might see people who are going to travel to work or going on business meetings, and they'll connect their phone to their laptop to give it an internet connection. So a lot of laptops don't actually have an inbuilt mobile network. They will just have a router built in or a network adapter to allow them to connect to the internet. So what they do is they use their phone as a personal hotspot, and they connect their laptop to the phone and use it to connect to the internet. Now, this whole process of connecting to a hotspot is called tethering. Basically, devices connect to another device and share an internet connection. So some of you might have historically done some computer science lower down in the school. What you might find is that you've heard of something called a local area network or a wide area network, short as LANs and WANs. So what this is called is a PAN for short, and it's basically a personal area network. So what that means is it's a network that's specifically for you. It's in your personal area, which means it's going to be over a very, very, very small area. So what that usually involves is when you connect computers or devices together using Wi-Fi in a very small area or using Bluetooth in a small area. So the best example of personal area networks is when you create a connection between your game controller and your console, your hands-free, so say like your car stereo and your phone, and maybe your phone and speakers so that you can play music. So a personal area network has only got a range of a very small area, maybe a few meters. You need to usually pair the devices for security. So you might have experienced this with a PlayStation pad or an Xbox pad, where after you haven't used it for a certain amount of time, you have to reconnect it, you have to repair the controller. You also might have seen it in a car, or anytime you want to connect to an open hotspot, you need to pair the devices to allow it to work. So if you've ever connected your phone to a Bluetooth speaker, you will have had to have paired the devices. This is to stop people just basically connecting to a random speaker and playing their music through it. The word or the term pairing is when both devices agree to that connection. So one of the key terms that we need to focus on in this sort of topic is infrastructure. Notice the spelling is a little bit of a funny way of spelling a word, and you have to get the hang of that because you might be asked to use this word in the exam. So it's infrastructure. Now what that means is whenever you hear that term, it's talking about all of the physical hardware that you need for something. So it's about like the logistics, it's how do we set up a network. So when we're talking about what's the available infrastructure, it's what is there, what hardware have we got that we can create a network with. So obviously for things like the internet, we have a lot of infrastructure. We've got satellites, you've got mobile towers, you've got cables under the floor, you've got cables above the floor, like out in the street, you've got telephone lines. Then once you get inside the buildings, you've got servers, routers, Ethernet cables, everything. The list is endless. But when we're looking at this particular case, we're thinking about what distance is involved. How far are we going to send this data and what infrastructure could we use? So over smaller distances, you would usually focus on copper cables, or you might have known them as Ethernet cables or Cat5. Then once it goes outside and goes under the street, it tends to switch to fiber cables so that we can get faster speeds. But obviously we also have the mobile networks, which you can use your mobile data. And you've also got satellites, which is what is used to beam generally TV signals. So when there's no other option, we will tend to focus on things like satellites. And that's when there's no possible way of using wires. It's a very, very long distance, or there's massive mountains and hills and lakes and stuff that are in the way. So we need to use satellite to send that data. So when we look at internet connections, usually to the home and to small businesses, you will use fiber internet when you want high speeds. So for speeds of roughly 80 Mbps, you're going to just use fiber cable, but that will only go to the general vicinity of your home. So you might have seen like green cable boxes at the end of the street, or other sort of cable looking boxes around your home. Now what happens is it'll use fiber to get to that particular area, but then from that cable box to your house, it turns into copper cable, and that's why your speed gets slightly restricted. However, some businesses, so real big businesses, Apple and Google and places like that, they would have direct fiber straight to the door. So that means they'll get speeds of up to 300 Mbps. So when we talk about mobile networks, this is obviously using the cell towers. So there are different generations of network that have progressed through the years. 2G was the first time it was digital, and this added things like the SMS, where you send text messages. 3G then started to improve data speeds and internet connections. And now we're obviously on to 4G and 5G, which increase the speeds a lot so that you can start getting a lot faster data transfer. Now, what we might not be aware of is that some places around the country, you have to rely on the mobile network because you don't have what we call the infrastructure to put all of the cables to go to people's houses. This could be because of water, so like lakes and rivers and things like that. Could be mountains and big buildings, anything like that, or just sheer distance, just too far away from anywhere. So with the mobile networks, black spots are something that can crop up because the whole world is basically divided into areas called cells. And each one of those cells should, in theory, have a mobile phone transmitter. But obviously some of them won't have them. The reason for that, it could just be it's so far away from anywhere that it's just too far to put up a cell tower. Another reason could be that it's too high up, like a mountain or a hill, or there's a big load of water. So when there's no cell tower or you get too far away, that's when you start to get less signal. So anytime you've got a drop in signal, this could be called a black spot. The main causes are mountains and hills and rivers. However, large buildings and thick walls and things like that can obviously create black spots as well. So when we're talking about black spots, they tend to pop up in rural locations. So what we mean by rural is in the countryside, in like a sort of less densely populated or remote area. So as you can see on one of the images that comes up, it is basically right out in the middle of nowhere. So if you were to live in that house or stay in that house, it'd be very unlikely that you'd have a good cell service. So if you'd be able to get on the internet or even call anybody using the mobile network. That's because if you look around, there's loads of hills, loads of mountains, and they are miles away from anywhere. Okay, an urban location would be a built-up city, as you can see here, which I think is Tokyo. So we can look at a really busy city, which is called an urban location. This is a built-up inner city area. So they will normally have much faster internet, and that's because we can set up a lot of infrastructure. We can put a lot of cables in, a lot of hardware, and we can do that because the cost of it all can be shared between multiple people. So if you've got 1 million people living in one particular area and they all pay like £20 a month each for the internet, all of that money combined is what allows it to be possible. It allows you to build all of that infrastructure. So one experience you might have had in your life is you might have been to somewhere like Colomendy, or anytime if you've ever been to Wales on holiday, there'll be certain areas where you've been unable to get any internet connection. So one of the major festivals in England is in Glastonbury, and I'm sure you've probably heard of that. What people were finding is that when they went down there, they just couldn't get any internet service or be able to call anybody. One of the reasons for this is obviously because it's in the middle of nowhere, it doesn't have the infrastructure in place, but also when there's so many people within one area, you can start getting jamming as well. So what they actually did was EE, which is a big network company, is they installed a permanent 4G base station so that everybody had a better connection. But sometimes what they do is people will bring vans along, and it's like a mobile network station that allows people to connect up temporarily. So if we think about how this might be the case, because what we've just looked at is, obviously we looked at Tokyo, and I think the other picture was in Wales somewhere. So what you need to think about is that in some countries in the world, the rural problems, so things with no infrastructure or massive spaces with no real built up areas, they can have real problems. So what we tend to call developing countries, so a lot of the African countries, for example, they don't really have any decent connections to the internet. That is generally because of lack of funding, so lack of finance, so it tends to be in more poorer countries. They just don't have the money to put the infrastructure in place. So obviously if you want to set up business in those countries, it's going to create a problem. It also creates a problem because those children in those countries obviously don't have the same access to everything that you get. So they won't have the same access to education, they won't have the same access to all the entertainment such as online gaming and Netflix and so on. So as we can see here with this map, it's essentially showing you colours around the world just to show you how little access people have to certain parts. So what it's basically showing you is that people who actually access the internet the most live in these particular areas. and people who have almost no access to the internet live in others. So you can see that the majority of Africa is in red. You can also see that some of it is in orange as well. And then when you get up to the big orange area, this is because it's in massive spaces where there's nothing really there. So it's a lot of ice, a lot of really, really cold areas and distant areas with nothing really there. So that is why they tend to not penetrate the internet. As we said before, infrastructure is needed for the internet, and a lot of these people don't have the finances or the ability to set up that infrastructure.